Hitler planned to create buildings bigger and better than anything that had gone before. A domed hall so large that the Eiffel Tower could be fitted inside it. A stadium that would hold 400,000 people. But his dream was never fully realized, and it died with him at the end of World War II.
The capital of the world. That was the title that inspired Adolf Hitler to begin creating in his mind a city like no other. It would be the center of the Third Reich, and after the war, the symbol of the nascent German Empire. Monumental constructions would adorn the streets, and the territory of Berlin would give rise to the incredible Germania. That would be the name of the greatest architectural manifestation of Nazi power, Aryan supremacy, and the eternal legacy of the Führer. The project created by the German leader was not only destined to be an urbanistic achievement, but also a key instrument in the regime's propaganda, psychological control of the population, and world domination. In this new military history video, we will learn everything about the mega city conceived by Hitler, the most surprising ideas, the greatest challenges, and its final destiny.
In 1941, Europe was a battlefield. World War II was raging. The Third Reich was a military state geared for conquest. Adolf Hitler and his architect Albert Speer are planning a new world capital to be called Germania. They had built the Olympic Stadium and the Reich Chancellery. They planned a great hall, another stadium, and vast triumphal arch, a whole new city. But Allied bombs threatened their dream.
On April 1st, 1920, a veteran of the First World War left the defeated German army to devote himself fully to politics. He was advancing within a group that same day changed its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which would later become better known as the Nazi Party. As you can imagine, we are talking about Adolf Hitler, who quickly gained ground and became one of the undisputed leaders of the movement. From that moment on, he made clear his great ambitions and did not stop until he achieved them. On January 30th, 1933, he became the new German Chancellor with the firm commitment to return the country to the greatness it had lost due to the war. Several ideas accompanied him to achieve this goal, including that of enlisting a powerful army capable of conquering all of Europe to rebuild an empire. Convinced that he would achieve it, the Führer was passionate about thinking about the legacy that his name would leave behind. Going back a little in time, at the end of 1923, Hitler organized a coup d'etat. He failed to achieve his goal and spent 9 months in prison. While confined, he wrote his autobiography called My Struggle. In its pages, he left a clue of what he planned, so that his conquests would not simply be reduced to the pages of history books. Hitler had designed sketches of enormous and ostentatious buildings. These were the first vestiges of a mega project to build the capital of the Third Reich, and consequently, of the New World. Its name? Germania.
As the greatest military power, Hitler will rebuild their nation. He will create a new world capital on the site of Berlin. He will call it Germania. And throughout his career, Hitler will use buildings to symbolize Nazi supremacy, to stake a claim on a place in history, and as a means of presenting his carefully created image to the world.
The plan was to turn Berlin into a monumental and grandiose metropolis, designed to reflect the power and supremacy of Nazi Germany. This transformation was planned primarily by the Führer, but the task of making it a reality fell to his trusted architect, Albert Speer. This man began working with Hitler in 1934 and was part of projects of great importance to the regime. An example is the Zeppelin Field, located in Nuremberg, the favorite place of the Nazi Party. This city was one of the favorites of the German Chancellor and had been declared the headquarters of the Congresses of the Third Reich. From that decision, each year it would bring together for a week around 500,000 National Socialists of the country. This required a suitable space for the meetings, and it was Speer who made it possible.
The site is derelict and overgrown, a memory of a shameful era. But Speer's vast open arena is still here. It's the size of 12 football fields, enclosed by 36 stone towers. At one end stands the Zeppelin Tribune, the platform where Nazi leaders would address uniformed ranks of party members. The platform is 1,300 feet long and 65 feet high. 60,000 people sat here to watch parades and military displays in the field below.
Through hard work, and with the aim of materializing Adolf Hitler's enormous dreams, Speer became one of his most trusted men. He earned a prominent place among the Nazi hierarchy, and his name was the first to be considered when an infrastructure project needed to be carried out. The Führer believed that the monumentality of the buildings would be a reflection of the eternal power of the Third Reich and the superiority of the Aryan race. For that reason, architecture had a key ideological and propaganda function in the Nazi regime. Without a doubt, this view was one of the fundamental axes when preparing to host the 1936 Olympic Games in Berlin. The Germans perfectly combined the publicity of a sporting event of such magnitude with the spectacular nature of the stadium that was completed thanks to the contributions of Albert Speer himself. Large spaces were created and solid materials were used that accompanied the projection of a strong and prosperous Third Reich that Hitler had created for the rest of the world. By then, the Nazi leader was delighted with the work of his trusted architect and put him back in charge of an initiative in Nuremberg. It was the final test. If he passed it successfully, there would be no doubt that he was the right man to carry out the Germania megaproject.
The success of the Nuremberg rallies persuaded Hitler that the city needed a new indoor home for the party's massed conventions. He decided to build the Congress Hall, where up to 60,000 followers could gather to hear him and his henchmen speak. This would be a completely new type of building. Again, he took inspiration from the classical world, this time the Colosseum of ancient Rome.
Hitler often talked about outdoing Rome, both architecturally and in terms of its military power.
The building plans fascinated the Führer, and he made the decision. Albert Speer was ready to take charge of the construction of the new capital of the world. The challenge was to make the architecture make clear its deep connection with the political and ideological aspirations of Nazism. As we have already mentioned, one of the main objectives was for Germania to reflect the power and supremacy of the Third Reich. Berlin would become the most imposing metropolis on the planet, surpassing other cities such as London, Paris, or Rome. The mega-project was to symbolize the greatness and dominance of a victorious Germany and its new global order, with Hitler as its absolute leader. On the other hand, the new city was also to represent the purity of the Aryan race. Gigantic buildings, wide avenues, and colossal proportions would contribute to the idea that the Germans were a superior people, capable of great deeds. And in turn, this type of design was intended to make individuals feel small in comparison to the power of the state. This psychological impact provided a sense of control over citizens. Hitler himself believed that public spaces and giant monuments also functioned as a sort of constant reminder to the population that the Nazi regime was omnipotent and eternal. Architecture, in this case, was used as a means to create a feeling of individual powerlessness and submission to the government. Lastly, in addition to all these benefits, the buildings would endure over time. This satisfied the Führer's obsession with leaving a lasting historical legacy. Inspired by the ruins of ancient Rome that continued to impress visitors thousands of years later, he hoped that Germania would become eternal, serving as a testament to the power of the Third Reich. With these aspects clear, it is time to learn about some of the most important projects that were part of the megaplan, starting with the look into the past that the city of Berlin gives us today.
It was a former street so-called Charlottenburger Chaussee, and it was made wider in the middle 30s and was reopened on Hitler's birthday on 1939.
So this big wide street is all a big birthday present for Hitler?
Yes, and there was a big parade on his birthday here. This was the opening ceremony of this street from Germania.
This small remnant of Nazi Germany was part of the first project we will learn about. It is the Great East-West Axis, a huge boulevard of approximately 50 kilometers that was to extend, as its name suggests, across Berlin from east to west, connecting some of the city's main monuments and buildings. Surrounded by important government buildings, it was planned to be 120 meters wide in some sections. This monumental work was intended to recall the triumphal avenues of ancient empires, such as Rome. Its development would involve the demolition of large parts of existing Berlin, displacing thousands of inhabitants. The project took this into account and included the relocation of entire sectors of the population. Moving forward, we find another of Adolf Hitler's great wishes, an Arc de Triomphe. This was to be significantly larger than any other built until then, including the famous monument in Paris. The German arch was to be about 117 meters high, more than twice as high as the Parisian one, which is 50 meters high. In addition, the Führer wanted it to be another 170 meters wide. The aim was to symbolize the victory that the Third Reich army would achieve, which would be the greatest in history according to the Nazi leader. On the other hand, like the rest of the projects, it would serve to show the new world domination that the regime aspired to achieve. One of the details that would characterize it was that the names of all the German soldiers killed in the First World War were planned to be carved inside it. This triumphal arch would form part of the Great East-West Axis and was intended to be one of the first sights for those entering the city. But there was still more, probably the most emblematic work born in the mind of Adolf Hitler, and the one that would make Germania an imposing capital throughout the world. We are referring to the Volkshalle, the People's Hall.
In 1936, Hitler unveiled plans for the most ambitious of all his building projects. A vast domed space called the Great Hall.
The Great Hall was the absolute focal point of the North-South axis. It was a gigantic building which had by far the largest dome in the world at the time.
It was intended to be the most important of all of Germania's buildings, a symbol of greatness.
The People's Hall was Hitler and Speer's most ambitious architectural project. This building was intended to be the central point of Germania, symbolizing the power of the Third Reich and its control over the world. Continuing the megalomaniacal logic surrounding the Führer, the enormous dimensions would be a reflection of superiority, and that is why this work would be immense. Its dome would be 290 meters high, more than 16 times the size of the one that covers St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. In addition, it would have a diameter of 250 meters. It was estimated that it could hold 180,000 people, which would make it one of the largest structures ever planned. In this space, mass meetings of the Nazi Party, propaganda events, speeches by Hitler and other acts of state would be held. The idea was to project an image of greatness and omnipotence that would intimidate both citizens and foreign leaders who visited the city. Inside, the building was to have a minimalist yet grand design, with a vast empty space meant to inspire a sense of smallness in the face of the power of the Reich. The Führer planned for the words spoken within this room to resonate as if the place were sacred, thus amplifying the psychological effect on those in attendance. Nothing would be left to chance. This work would become the great Nazi symbol, and the entire world would fall at the feet of Adolf Hitler. However, structures of this size required exorbitant amounts of labor. The Germans had to solve this challenge, so the project developers quickly turned to military commander Heinrich Himmler. He was the leader of the SS and supervisor of the concentration camps, who agreed with Speer to use prisoners for the necessary work. In addition, the architect also made use of beggars, gypsies, and pimps, who lived on the streets to begin building Germania. It is estimated that the Nazis had around 130,000 people to begin construction of the new city.
Outside the city lies a center for the production of building materials. It reveals the truly brutal nature of Hitler's quest for glory. It is part of the concentration camp Sachsenhausen. Germania was meant to be built on slave labor.
Despite the suffering of the prisoners who had to work, and the thousands of Berliners who would be displaced from their homes to carry out the pharaonic works, the Nazi regime presented part of the plan with great pride in different public speeches. The intention was to show the population that the Third Reich was building a modern and powerful capital, in line with the vision of a new Germany promised by Adolf Hitler. Scale models and plans of some projects such as the Arc de Triomphe or the People's Hall were also displayed. These were used as propaganda to generate support and enthusiasm in the people when they saw the attractive aesthetics of the large buildings. However, other aspects were kept secret and were not revealed, mainly because of how extremely ambitious and costly they were in terms of resources and time. The Führer did not want his colossal plans to be perceived as unattainable or a waste of the Nazi government in times of war. The German leader believed that he could carry it out anyway, confident that his powerful army would have no trouble achieving victory in the conflict that began to break out in Europe on September 1st, 1939. However, he was very wrong. In 1942, when the Second World War had been going on for almost 3 years, the Nazis were forced to increase their military budget. Hitler's troops had encountered a tenacious rival in the Soviet Union, and their unstoppable advance suddenly came to a halt. The situation worried the Führer, who immediately allocated the money from the Germania megacity project to other areas. Albert Speer's bulging bank account was dissolved, and some 321 million marks went into a fund to cover expenses related to the fighting that was taking place in much of the world. In fact, the architect who was to create the capital of the new empire was transferred to a position very different from that of his interests. He became Reich Minister of Armaments and Munitions. The idea of turning an entire city upside down to build an emblem of Nazi power from scratch, something that could no longer even be seen on the battlefield, was a long way off. 3 years later, Berlin was cornered by war. The Red Army was pulverizing the Führer's megalomaniacal and delirious idea of erecting an enormously large world capital in the center of Europe.
Hitler's world shrunk to a warren of chambers, a concrete tomb. Above him, Allied bombs and shells destroyed Berlin, killing any possibility that his fantasy city of Germania would ever be realized. The Hitler-Speer partnership that had begun 11 years earlier with such ambitious plans had ended in absolute defeat.
Finally, amid the sounds of bombs and artillery on April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler took his own life in his bunker, located under the Reich Chancellery. The dictator left, and his dream of Germania went with him. Much of Germany was devastated, and Berlin was no exception. The ruined capital caused great suffering and pain to the civilian population. They had no water, food, or medical care to cope with the difficult post-war conditions. It took many years for the city, divided into two ideologies by the occupation of the Soviet Union and the Allies, to flourish again. However, it did. Now, more than 80 years after the idea of Germania, you can still see some small vestige of what would have been Hitler's dream. The Great Arch of Triumph still exists in Berlin. It is a pillar made to test the weight of concrete in order to advance the monument drawn by the Führer in his book. Speer had ordered the so-called Heavy Lift Corps to be built in 1941 as a solid concrete construction, 21 meters in diameter, 14 meters high, and 18 meters underground. Over time, engineers and architects have questioned the feasibility of such a massive project, pointing out that Berlin's marshy terrain would not have supported the megastructures Hitler wanted. However, we will never know the truth. Now, after having learned about the incredible plan of Nazism to build the capital of a world empire, the time has come to say goodbye. Thank you very much for having accompanied us to the end. We look forward to seeing you again in the next military history video.